Go. Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. My guest today is Warren Allmon, who's the director of the Museum of the Earth based in Ithaca, New York, which is not just a public museum, but a world-class research institute. Welcome, Warren.
Thank you, David. It's nice to be here.
And, so much of the magazine is about evolution in relation to human affairs, which is new and exciting, but we can never forget that evolution is centered on biology, and especially centered on the deep, deep history of life, which is what your work is all about. And so I'm really happy to have this interview with you and to welcome you to the magazine as someone who might do quite a lot of interviewing yourself and to help us introduce us to the world of paleontology. Now, you're actually descended from royalty, are you not? Are you not a direct descendant of the legendary Stephen Jay Gould? Am I right about that?
I am. I was his student, yes.
Well, that must have been really memorable. Well, tell us a little bit about the museum and introduce for the readers of this magazine the field of paleontology through your institute.
Oh, well, to do those in reverse, I'll just say that the history of my institution kind of mirrors the 20th century history of paleontology. So our institution, which is the Paleontological Research Institution, of which the Museum of the Earth is a piece, was founded 80 years ago. We were founded by a Cornell professor named Gilbert Harris in 1932. He was a legendary paleontologist. He was a very, very important early 20th century paleontologist. But like invertebrate paleontologists of his time, he was a descriptive systematist. He described Cenozoic mollusks, and one of his goals in life was to describe all the species of Paleocene and Eocene mollusks in the Gulf and Atlantic coastal plain. And most people today hear a description of a life goal like that, and they think it's kind of quaint. But that is what invertebrate paleontology was 100 years ago, and Cornell was a center for it.
And New York is a great region of the country for invertebrate fossils, isn't that right?
Absolutely. And so, in fact, the readers or listeners of the magazine, if you want proof of that, the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian periods those terms were coined by a Cornell professor. I mean, invertebrate paleontology has deep, deep roots in New York State, and so all of that was very traditional and well done at Cornell University. My founder, Gilbert Harris, was also one of the world's first petroleum geologists. He did he was state geologist of Louisiana for a decade or so while he was a Cornell professor. We would now call that a conflict of interest, by the way. And he did some really path-breaking work on salt domes in the Gulf Coast, which is where Gulf petroleum comes from. So anyway, he was a very cutting-edge traditional paleontologist of his time. He barely mentioned, he published a big stack of books during his career. He barely mentioned evolution, for example.
Oh, okay.
Which was exactly typical of the vast majority of invertebrate paleontologists of his time. So
that sounds so strange. How is that possible?
Oh, because the vast majority of invertebrate paleontology has always been, as some of us say, a dating service for geology. Invertebrate fossils are still today the most useful way of telling time in geology. And it just so happens that they were once alive, but that's really a sidelight to the fact that they help us find our way around in rocks. And vertebrate fossils are different. Vertebrate fossils are rare and exotic, and so they have less stratigraphic value. Fossil plants are kind of in the middle. So plants and vertebrates have traditionally been the topic of more biologically inclined paleontologists, and invertebrates have been almost exclusively, up until really my lifetime, invertebrates were the purview of geology departments, and because that's what geologists needed to know.
Okay.
And so paleontology was, as is now kind of common for everybody to know, paleontology was a handmaiden to geology for the 19th and at least the first 3/4 of the 20th century. And so my institution's founder was representative of that. And so he built a collection. He published a journal. He founded his own journal in 1895. We continue to publish it. It's called Bulletins of American Paleontology. It's the oldest continuously published paleontological journal in the Western Hemisphere, one of the 3 or 4 oldest in the world. And nobody's ever heard of it unless you're an invertebrate paleontologist. But every invertebrate paleontologist has heard it. So,
all 25 of them, or I'm being cruel, right?
You're being a little cruel, yes. No, we're very, very well known as an institution to the invertebrate paleontology community. I'm always fascinated to travel abroad, especially because people think that they've heard of PRI and they think that we're a much larger organization than we really are.
Although having just visited your facility, I'm impressed by how large it is. I mean, it's really quite something there on the shores of Cayuga Lake. Who would have thought that you'd have such an extensive facility there?
Well, so all of that is fairly recent. Up until 1992, we were a pretty small place. The only reason we had any claim to notoriety beyond Ithaca was that we had a very large fossil collection, and we continued to publish this journal. The bulletins were started being published in 1895, and yet there was a problem. The problem was that Gilbert Harris had a temper tantrum with the university. He was getting ready to retire, and he said, "I want you to build me a fireproof building." He was paranoid of fire. "I want you to safeguard my collection, safeguard my printing operation, and I want you to do it right now." And he, to put it mildly, he had not endeared himself to the administration. And so they didn't think they owed him anything. He didn't think he owed them anything. And so he took half of Cornell's fossil collection and basically took his toys and went home. And he went about 500 yards behind Cornell's campus, ceded a small piece of property next to his house, got himself a state charter from the Board of Regents of the State University of New York, and started his own institution in the depths of the Great Depression, which was an extraordinarily misguided thing to do. And he lived another 20 years, continuing to do field work and make collections and publish monographs. He passed it on to one of his PhD students, a woman named Catherine Palmer, who everybody has heard of if you work on Cenozoic mollusks. She was the first woman in America to win the Paleontological Society medal. She was a real giant in coastal plain malacology. She ran PRI until she was 83 years old. She retired in 1978. And I arrived in 1992. And the Board of Trustees told me to bring PRI into the late 20th century. And I said, well, exactly how do you want to do that? And they said, well, we don't really know, but serving a few dozen scientists is not enough. And that became known as the yellow school bus problem. And the yellow school bus problem for our organization was that we have all these great fossils and we publish a very prestigious journal, but nobody knows we're here.
Right.
And if somebody had left us $50 million 100 years ago, then that would have been fine, but they didn't. And also, more seriously, at least from my point of view, what's the good of having all these fossils if they only serve a very small number of specialists? So, very long story short, in 1992, we set out to upgrade not just the collections and the research, but the public outreach. And so the Museum of the Earth is one very large piece of kind of the culmination of this couple of decades of work. The Museum of the Earth is essentially the principal natural history museum between New York City and Buffalo. It's not called the Museum of Dead Fossils. It's called the Museum of the Earth because we take as our topic the entirety of the Earth, including biology. So it's really a natural history museum, but we call it the Museum of the Earth. And we are not part of Cornell, but we have rebuilt a lot of those relationships, and we are affiliated with Cornell, and several of us are on the faculty there. So we serve as not the natural history museum for Cornell, which brings back full circle what was broken 80 years ago, which is kind of satisfying.
Yeah.
And so now we act like we're a university natural history museum. Cornell students are here all the time, and I supervise PhD students, and a couple of my colleagues do, and we teach and so forth. So we're a part of the Cornell community, even though we serve lots of other institutions, including your own. And so what does all that have to do with paleontology in general? That's what I said when we started, is that little history that I've just told you really is kind of like the history of paleontology in the 20th century. So 100 years ago, invertebrate paleontology was a dating service for geology. There were a few people that thought about evolution, but really not much. Now that's all different. Now, within my career, we've gone from basically being stratigraphers to being evolutionary biologists. And the vast majority of paleontologists now are invertebrate paleontologists, are evolutionary biologists, one way or the other.
So what are some of the major questions that that you and they are considering?
Well, what's kind of the best illustration of that is open any mainstream evolution textbook. And instead of the obligatory kind of walk through time that you would have seen maybe 50 years ago in a textbook, you now see a chapter titled maybe macroevolution or large-scale patterns and processes. And so everything from punctuated equilibrium to mass extinction to large-scale diversity patterns, all this is mainstream stuff now in evolutionary biology, which was absolutely not the case when I was an undergraduate, for example.
Right.
And then more broadly, the kind of last piece to this transformation, my own institution and the field in general, which I think is really interesting, is that when I was an undergraduate 25 years ago, paleontology was a pretty arcane. I mean, we were a dating service for geology, and a lot of us worked for oil companies. But
you have to clarify the term dating service, my friend. It has two meanings, and
yes, it's a double entendre that we're very fond of. And a lot of us work for oil companies. Now, interestingly, paleontology is at the forefront of conservation biology and of understanding the effects of global climate change.
Right.
And so that affects my own institution because not only do we have 8 PhDs here on staff and lots of students, and many of us work on some combination of macroevolution, climate change, effects of climate change on life, and what that might tell us about the future. My colleague Greg Dietl here at PRI, for example, is one of the founders of this emerging field called conservation paleobiology, which is literally a brand new subfield that takes the insights from deep time and applies them to the future.
Wow.
So that's a real surprise. And we now use the museum and our other outreach activities to tell the general public about that.
Wow, that's amazing. So I know that there's major meetings. The Geological Society of America is coming up, the major paleo meetings. You're going to be going to it and maybe bringing back some stories for us. But
I certainly hope so. Every year, the GSA meetings are the big paleo gathering of the year. It's about 5,000 or 6,000 geologists, close to a quarter or about a fifth. I think about 20% of that 5,000 or 6,000 are paleontologists. It's
wow.
The biggest single subject at the GSA, and so it's the place where it's the time of year where people come and talk about what they're doing. And so evolution is, you would think you were in an evolution meeting. So it is. There'll be lots of interesting topics to talk about. I'm anticipating, for example, a lot of news, as always, about mass extinction, the Cambrian explosion. But also, I actually am co-chairing a session on species and speciation in the fossil record, which is perhaps getting kind of back into center stage. Not punctuated equilibrium, but how paleontologists can talk about species. So we can. I hope I'll come back and report about that. But there's the diversity of topics that are paleontologically relevant to evolution is just huge. And so I'm sure there'll be lots to report back from Minneapolis.
Well, that's great. And it's been a real pleasure to get to know you even better on the basis of the magazine that we've just started up. There's a lot of common ground between your mission and the mission of Evolution, This View of Life, and I rely on people like you to keep the magazine centered in biology, so not just that human stuff that I work on. A lot of my colleagues think that I've kind of gone off the deep end. But so it's great that you're starting to appear on our pages, and I look forward to seeing more of you. So,
we are really excited to partner with you, David, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you.
Great. So this is David Sloan Wilson signing off for Evolution, This View of Life. Thanks a lot, Warren. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye.